what do you think it means to live a vowed life? The word vow, even, is somewhat of an intimidating term, because when we say we're making a vow, it seems like we're making, let's say, a promise. And it's a bit more, let's say, committed than just simply saying, oh, I'm going to, go to the store today. It's a bit different than saying, I am going to do something. It is saying that it is upon my own self, my own honor, that I am going to perform or do a certain thing at a certain point in time. Or we are vowing to commit to something for a long period of time. And that's really what vows often are often couched as. They are long-term promises. Not that promises are not themselves binding, but there is a seriousness to vows that, let's just say, making a pinky promise doesn't simply carry the same weight as. But before we even get into the question of what we think about vows, we need to think about what, just in general, vows are. And the kind of general understanding within the Christian tradition is that a vow is, in fact, a promise, but not simply just a promise. It is a promise that involves God in some way. We'll talk about this here in just a couple of minutes, about what the introduction kind of pulled on in order to kind of get to that particular point. But we have to kind of get underneath ourselves. Why are we talking about vows? Why does it matter? Why are we thinking about these kind of extra promises we make? Well, the thing is about making a vow is that we are taking upon ourselves a responsibility that we are going to do something no matter what else happens. We are committing ourselves fully to really living a certain way, and that involves a giving up of a level of autonomy, or at least that's what it seems like we're doing. And that is what one of the paradoxes that we first need to kind of highlight in this idea of vows. Now, within the Episcopal Church and within the Church of England's context, vows are, within the contemporary language, at least as it comes to this book, we are seeing culturally, especially within the past 20 years, a renewed fervor behind demands. The demands of what church asks of us, or just to put it plainly, the demands of what Jesus asks of us. And paradoxically, there is also a fear of demand. There is a fear of responsibility in which when we say that we're taking on responsibilities, does that mean that I am losing control of my life? These two dueling poles of vows, the deep desire and longing for something deeper, and the fear that if we delve into that depth, that we're simply going to be disappointed, or at worst, we're going to lose our freedoms or lose ourselves. Both of those things are involved with the more recent sort of theological discussions. But this is brought on by a simple historical fact, a simple historical truth, which is that Christianity, largely, Christianity in the western part of the world, primarily the northwestern part of the world, such as where the Church of England is, such as where the Episcopal Church is here in the United States, Christianity is in decline. And not that Christianity is losing its truth. That's not what we mean by decline. What we mean is numerically. And one of the tensions that was brought up within the past 60 years was the particular tensions about rigor versus freedom. And especially in the 1960s, this particular polarity played itself out quite publicly within the cultural wars within the United States. The kind of tumultuous upturning and overturning of traditional mores, and not saying that the traditional mores were not needing to be unexamined or need to be reformed, but simply there was a throwing off of quote-unquote traditional ideas. This plays itself out in a lot of ways, and so you can certainly go and look up what those ways looked like more in the United States. But all that to say is that the stripping away of this idea of vows and responsibility because they were seen as stifling freedom is something that was carried over through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, where in a lot of ways, general mainline Protestantism began to really shrink away from the, let's say, focus on evangelism, where the evangelistic fervor began to rely much less on this sort of disciplined, ordered life, and more of a kind of open, welcoming, sort of non-demanding atmosphere. Now, on its face, that does not seem to be a bad thing. There are all kinds of different ways that we can slice that watermelon. However, the assumption, the cultural assumption that demands stifle freedom is the core of where this paradox about vows come from. Because it recognizes, I think, something that maybe might be a more deep-seated fear, which is that what if the vows don't last? This has been one of the bigger fights within the past 100 years over the, really, what status do people who are divorced have? And is there, in fact, appropriate means and appropriate times when one should seek divorce? Because again, when we talk about the vows of marriage, we talk about the vows of marriage as until death do them part, right? Well, let's extend that to other things, because within the traditional liturgies of the church, such as in the Church of England, Roman Catholic Church, Eastern Orthodox Church, we make vows not just in marriage, but we make vows in our baptisms. We vow to do certain things in our baptisms, and those baptismal vows are most certainly binding upon our lives. But there is another sacrament that is observed in the Church of England, Roman Catholic Church, that is called the sacrament of confirmation, which is a sacrament by our Book of Common Prayer, which is a public adult owning of our faith. And in that particular sacrament where we are publicly owning our own faith, we are indeed making a vow that we are going to live, breathe, and uphold this particular expression of the faith. But especially within the Episcopal Church within the United States, the sacrament of confirmation has been suppressed a little bit because we want to raise the chief importance of baptism, because baptism is that thing of which we are vowing to Christ. That's absolutely correct. However, as in the introduction, Dr. Coakley wants to highlight that while we could couch the raising of baptism into the kind of chiefly important vow that we make, and then confirmation maybe not being nearly as important as we might make it seem, Dr. Coakley wants to ask a question as to why we're doing this, and maybe not merely for the historical reasons that might have to do with the history of liturgy, but more with what about the vows of baptism? And what about the vows of confirmation? Are we potentially skirting, or are we potentially nervous about something about them? Again, to highlight that paradox, we are interestingly situated between a deep longing for something deeper and a profound fear that if we delve into it deeply, we're going to lose our freedoms. This cultural assumption is something that perhaps warrants further theological investigation. Hence, why we're doing this study. What does it mean to vow? And just kind of fundamentally, what does it mean to vow in church? What does it mean to make a promise to God and to the local church that I am going to do these things? Why is it something that so many people seek for? And why is it something that causes so much fear and anxiety? Well, let's take a look at this. We're going to go to our whiteboard and we're going to examine a bit of the theses behind what the book is going to try to do over our subsequent weeks of this book study. The theses that are going to come in are going to be particular to Anglicanism, particularly to the Episcopal Church, from, again, our own intra-church perspective, but I imagine that the wider discussion of what these vows mean are going to be universally important for all of us. Because getting straight what it means to promise something to God, I think is going to be important, not just for us, but really for all Christians to get straight. And actually, perhaps particularly us Western Christians, us Northwestern Christians, in the kind of light of a lessening of the demands of church. Is that good? Is that bad? Well, let's take a look at it. Obviously, what we have to talk about as it comes to vows in the church is simply what a vow is. The paradox of the fear and demand of vows are going to be a centrally important part of the discussions within the book. Because if we don't know what they mean, if we don't know what we mean by vows, there could be all kinds of various things that come into the kind of assumptions that we make in it, right? In fact, I had a great conversation with a friend of mine who's a professor who brought up this exact quandary that we run into that is highlighted in the introduction to this book of, if vows are so important in Christianity, why does it seem like Jesus is really not interested in vowing? Because if you remember in the Gospels, Jesus has that famous passage in the Sermon on the Mount where, if you do not swear by anything. Do not swear by heaven above, for it is God's realm. Do not swear by the earth below, it is God's footstool. Don't even swear by the hairs of your head, because you can't even make one white or one black. Instead, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Well, in fact, Dr. Coakley is going to treat that here in just a moment, but it's a good question, because we have to ask ourselves, what does Jesus mean by swearing, right? And I think it's important because vows, swearing upon something, and in just a moment we're going to talk about oaths. There is a level at which there are promises within the Bible that we are holding as being rock solid, and yet we see violations of these vows all the time. Hence Jesus' instruction, let your yes be yes and your no be no. In other words, fundamentally, just do what you say you're going to do. Don't do what you say you're going to not do, right? Very simple. However, it's interesting to note that even within the context of the New Testament, we see vows being used in positive fashion as well. Remember when St. Paul is traveling with a group of vowed men, They are under a vow, and St. Paul himself goes under a vow, as he indeed makes his really kind of traditional Jewish observance. In fact, if you look at the Old Testament, there are, in fact, within the law of Moses, one of the first 5 books of the Bible, completely appropriate vows to be made. In fact, one of the central ones that is made is the Nazirite vow that we see being used. A particular religious observance of which a promise is made before God that we are going to do something. Largely, that's what we're going to talk about as it comes to vows. And within the Episcopal Church and the Church of England, the first thesis of the introduction the first one is that they argue the Church of England, which is what COE is, and the Episcopal Church has lost a coherent theology of vows. A coherent theology of vows. Because within the prayer book tradition in the Episcopal Church and in the Church of England, there's something very simple that needs to be stated. It is a sacramental tradition. We have sacramental observances: the Holy Eucharist, baptism, confirmation, marriage, ordination, monastic vows. And the thing is that within the milieu of all of these various vows, they make the argument that the Church of England, Anglicanism, and the Episcopal Church, we've lost a coherent theology of vows. What that means is, have we lost what vows mean that connect across all of these things? Such that baptism informs what we're promising in marriage. There are so many times within the past, really within my own career, but also within simply the last couple of years, in which we can probably Google examples of this, of wedding ceremonies that use the Book of Common Prayer's language, to have and to hold from this day forward till death do us part. But then there are all kinds of other extra things about the wedding ceremony that, in fact, don't really resemble anything that have to do with church. It's kind of interesting, I think, that when people want to be married, and I find this to be the case with many couples, their immediate impulse is that this is a serious thing. And even the most laid-back weddings, even the most informal weddings, there are still central promises being made between two people. However, are those promises being made a part of the church's promises? To be completely honest, most handwritten or personally written vows have nothing to do with the church. Have nothing to do with the church because they don't have the baptismal understanding that baptism informs the vows we make in marriage. That is simply one of the things that leads to us being able to say that we've lost a coherent idea. And likewise, even within the vows of baptism, do we actually understand that the vows of baptism have everything to do with the vows that we would make for ministers? I think that that's a more obvious one, but do we actually look at the fact that those who come under the sacrament of ordination are in fact not simply taking on different vows than baptism, but rather it is a particular kind of vow within the context of baptismal vows. Again, the subtext to the book that we're reading is the promise and demand of baptism. It all is foundationally important under the baptismal umbrella. But do we actually operate that way? Think about another one. If we think about the vows of monasticism, something that we often think about when we think about monasticism is, oh, they're super religious, right? No pun intended for all of our vowed religious out there, but they're super religious. And this leads to a kind of funny, almost voyeurism of monasticism, where we're so interested in the exotic sort of life that they live, right? However, we have no desire, if we're honest with ourselves, to be under the type of vow that they're under. And yet, their vow has everything to do with the basic baptismal vow that we in the church are all under. And in fact, as Sarah Coakley points out, monastic vows have a lot more to do with the local parish than we sometimes think. And likewise, local baptismal understandings of vows and our understandings within the Episcopal Church and the Book of Common Prayer have way more to do with monasticism than we might think. Such that we are, by virtue of our baptism, under demands. It's a key word here. We are under demands that are appropriately asked of us. We are no longer our own. We are someone else's. And in other words, we are God's possession. We are Jesus's. Do we take that seriously? Again, do we have a coherent theology of vows? The second one simply can be summed up as baptism versus confirmation. Are baptismal vows and confirmation vows in conflict? Or, just to put it bluntly, do we really need confirmation? Do we really need it? Sorry about that. I realized I didn't turn off that. Baptism versus confirmation. Do we really need confirmation? Well, again, in the Church of England, in the Episcopal Church, confirmation is the adult owning of our faith. The adult owning of our faith. Okay? That might seem weird because for many Protestant traditions, including the one that I come from, in the Baptist tradition, well, isn't a public affirmation of faith required for baptism? Isn't baptism simply the outward ordinance in which you are sort of publicly announcing, I have this inward operating faith? Well, the problem with that is that we run into a theological question with that. Is faith interior? Is faith merely interior? And likewise, what does faith look like if it's merely interior? Or to put it in the more kind of technical fashion, is faith necessary interiorly? In other words, do we need to have that faith put in us in order to make this particular public affirmation? Or is there something that happens in the act of baptism itself that confers something to someone? The sacramental tradition answers that question differently. In the sacramental tradition of the Episcopal Church and the Anglican tradition, we believe stuff happens in the act of baptism itself. Again, there's all kinds of debate and disagreement we can get into over exactly what that means, but largely, baptism does something. And what we would like to perhaps say within the sacramental tradition is that baptism does what it says it does. Repent and be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins. And likewise, this aspect of being baptized into the body of Christ is being baptized into his real death and his real resurrection. As St. Paul would tell us, if we are buried in a death like his, we will be raised in a resurrection like his. Okay? So, what does confirmation have to do with that puzzle? Confirmation is the mature adult owning of the faith in which we say we're living. Is it redundant? That is what a lot of people have begun to argue. Confirmation is a redundancy of baptism. We're simply making the same types of vows we should have made in baptism anyway, or we are making the same vows that we're making in baptism. However, there's a problem with this, because how many of us have the experience of people who have grown up in church all of their life, who have been baptized, but whenever they grow up, they eventually disappear, and for some people, never come to church again? Did their baptism not work on them? That's a question we've got to answer, right? Did baptism not work? Did what they promised in baptism, was what they promised in baptism not really what they believed in the first place? And we get back to this fear, don't we? Did the promises that I made in baptism, even if the promises were simply, I believe in Jesus, did those promises not work? It's an uncomfortable question we're going to unpack within the next couple of weeks. But just to note, baptism versus confirmation is a big one in which the Church of England and the Episcopal Church finds itself right now. But there is a third one. There's a third one. I'm going to erase some of these. The question that we have to then ask, because it's so popular right now to want to take a look at other vows in the church, is what are the role of monastic vows? Monastic vows are something that we might associate with the Roman Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox tradition. However, in the Church of England, we have vowed monks and nuns. In fact, it was a big controversy this happened. But this leads to another question, or another thesis, I should say. Lifelong monastic vows and vows made in church by regular people are intimately intertwined. I would imagine that most of us do not consider ourselves monks or nuns in any sense of the form. However, this is a really interesting thesis, because when we talk about vows, lifelong vows, the first one we might have come into our head is marriage. However, if we were to talk about ordered communities who are under a vow, we then start talking about vowed religious orders in the church, such as the Benedictine monastics, such as the Cistercians, such as the Dominican monastics, all of which, by the way, have expression within the Church of England in some way, shape, or form. And we have to grapple with this interesting thing of vowed monastics and their vows of lifelong commitment actually have a lot more to do with us in regular church than we might actually think. Because the ways in which the vowed monastics make their common commitment to life in the earliest expression of Christian monasticism within the 300s, it simply needs to be said that these monastics did not understand their vows apart from anything else than a deepening commitment to Christ that anybody could be under. Anybody in the Christian church can test and discern the vows of monasticism. And that this was not a super religious order. In fact, one of the things that one of my friends who is a vowed monastic once said is that there is this sort of grass is greener approach to monasticism of, oh, if only all of the distractions in my life could go away, if only I could get to the monastery, then I would be able to pray, and then I'd be able to meet God. And you learn that you don't shelve your distractions. That in fact, when you go to the monastery, when you go on a monastic retreat perhaps, you learn you bring all of those distractions with you. That there is no such thing as ridding yourself of distraction. That's not what the monastery is for. And that's not what the parish church is for either. If we want to make a deeper kind of parallelism between the monastery and the parish church, the parish church is not some magical place that's going to make you holy. The parish church is where you meet God. God makes you holy. God does that. Jesus works with you. The parish church, however, is the body of Christ gathered in which every single person that is a part of that community is intimately involved with each other's lives in ways that they would not be otherwise. And that means that you are sitting next to someone in the pews that you would never otherwise be connected to if not for Jesus and the church. And in that way, you are going to be sitting next to people in the church who you might not like, who might rub you the wrong way, who you're maybe not friends with. But that's not the point of church. The point of church is for God to work on you. And in lifelong monastic vows, there is a fascinating parallel in that. Monks and nuns make those particular vows because they believe they're so called, but they don't do it without understanding that the thing that is the biggest barrier to my holiness is my own self. Not anybody else, it's me. And that's why I need Jesus. Or as we say in the Book of Common Prayer, whenever we make promises, I will, with God's help, I will do so. Okay? So, it's not by our own power, and most definitely is not the kind of idyllic idea of the super religious. In fact, it's actually far more mundane, far more boring, and likewise far more regular than we regular folks in the pews might treat monasticism. Anyway, I think that that's an important couple of theses that we get behind us. Again, the first is that there's a paradox of fear and anxiety, and likewise longing for deeper commitment. There is also a lack of coherency between vows that might underlie that particular paradox. There's also apparently a fight between confirmation and baptism that we are in the midst of trying to kind of mitigate in a lot of ways. That could be exterior pressures, but let's be honest, that probably also is a lack of kind of interior introspection within the Episcopal Church. But then also lifelong monastic vows and likewise regular person's vows in baptism are actually much more connected than we might say. And these are, in fact, the areas of interest that we're going to be looking at over the next several months. So in summary, what we're trying to do here in our Theology Thursday study of the vowed life is to situate ourselves in a particular way to examine what do we think we mean when we vow. Now, the rest of the chapter dealt with a fairly heady subject that I think warrants at least just a little bit of a touch on it, which is, what is the difference between a promise, an oath, and a vow? And to put it just simply, like we've talked about already, the main thing is that a vow is a promise we make before God and the church that we are going to do something. And the important part of that is before God. This is a religious observance. And likewise, baptism, confirmation, marriage, ordination, monasticism, all of these vows are caught up within the life of the church. And in order to begin to examine what exactly does it mean to live as a Christian, it is important for us to know what exactly we're promising and why we're promising it. So when we talk about the promises and demands of baptism, the vows we make in baptism, and likewise the vows we make in church, it's helpful for us to know what exactly we're doing. Next week, we're going to cover chapter 1, which is going to begin our step through of different essays written by different people. What I want to encourage those who are joining us for this book study to do is look up the biographies of our various authors, because you're not going to have professional theologians every time. You're going to have people who are going to be local parish clergy. You're going to have vowed monastics that are part of monastic communities. You're going to have lay people who are going to be writing. You're going to be writing in a professional capacity. And again, you will have, of course, Dr. Sarah Coakley, who's going to be able to give her wonderful and incredible insights that she has over her many years of study and many years of consistent practice in Christianity, and likewise her very much committed vowed life in Christianity. So you're going to get a number of different authors. When you go through the different essays that are written in this book, you'll get different flavors from different people. You'll like some more than others, and that's okay, because some of our discussions are going to be more, let's say, more scientific in the ways that we approach it, more theologically heavy, theologically precise, maybe I could say. But there are others that are going to be full of story. They're going to be full of real lived life experience that give rise to the importance of this question. And so, as we continue on, I encourage you to learn who it is who's writing for each of the chapters, and immerse yourself in the questions that they bring up, especially if those questions are foreign, and especially if the questions that they ask seem upsetting. Because one of the other things that you're going to encounter in this book is as Sarah Coakley and Matthew Bullimore, who edited this book, note, that the people who write for this book don't agree on everything. In fact, she even notes, I think quite importantly, that they have spirited disagreements over various things, and yet all of them believe that this is an important question to begin to unfold. So you'll have different theologies of what exactly baptism means. And it's not that it's a non-biblical theology, it's just that, just like I could not in good faith say that a local Baptist or Methodist understanding of baptism is a non-Christian idea, we have our disagreements over what exactly baptism is and does, but nonetheless, we still believe it is a primary observance, and at least for us in the sacramental tradition, it is a sacramental encounter with God. So just because you encounter ideas that are difficult or that you don't agree with, take the approach to this book of putting on different hats. Use the principle of the benefit of the doubt. give others the ability to explain as best as they can why they think the way that they do. You might uncover that not only is their viewpoint valid in many ways, but you might discover that your own viewpoint needs examination. And that's the work that we do as part of the church. We are constantly asking God to help us understand better this mystery that is the life of Christ. So in that, friends, please do continue to join us for our Vowed Life. And next week, we're going to deal with chapter 1 of the Vowed Life, and we're going to delve deeply into what exactly it means to live baptismally.